Hi, welcome to my review of Star Trek Beyond, directed by Justin Lin, an action sci-fi film centered on James T. Kirk and the USS Enterprise crew during a failed rescue mission that results in them crashing onto a planet inhabited by aliens who seek an artifact in the Enterprise's possession that is capable of unspeakable power. So Star Trek Beyond is directed not by J.J. Abrams, who of course directed the previous two, but Justin Lin, who is known for directing the Fast and the Furious films, those being Tokyo Drift to Fast and Furious 6. And Beyond is coming off of Into Darkness, which a lot of the really hardcore fans seem to really dislike, for reasons that essentially point to that it's just not Star Trek. Basically, instead of making a Star Trek movie that was like Star Trek, he made a Star Trek movie that was like Star Wars. As for me, being somebody who's never taken an interest in Star Trek until J.J. Abrams got a hold of it, I quite like the film. It's not as good as the first one, but I will say this, out of all the summer movies that came out in 2013, which may not be saying much because 2013 was not that great, I'd say it's the best one. As for Star Trek Beyond, though, it's been getting some pretty positive traction from critics as well as fans. But what I find perplexing is that out of the three, it's the least philosophical and the most action-oriented. Star Trek Beyond is a pure popcorn flick. In other words, it's a bit like Fast and the Furious, but in space. Though I suppose it doesn't necessarily sound completely terrible, that is, if you are somebody who's not going into this film looking for something with deeper meanings or characters. And that's not to say that there aren't any good character-centric moments in the film, like there's one scene towards the beginning featuring Karl Urban, who plays Bones, and Chris Pine, who plays, of course, Kirk. And it's a quiet, very genuine scene between the two of them. And the same can be said with another scene featuring Karl Urban, who, by the way, is fantastic as Bones, and Zachary Quinto as Spock. It's scenes like these that showcase that the people of the Starship Enterprise, they're not just colleagues, they are family. And the film places Kirk and Spock in these pretty interesting predicaments. On one end you have Kirk, who is struggling to maintain that desire to stay on as captain following his father's footsteps, and on the other end you have Spock, who's kind of dealing with something similar. They're both pondering that old question, which is, where exactly do I belong in life? And there's one character, Jayla, played by Sofia Boutella, who has an interesting backstory, but instead of exploring that or exploring her as a character, the film just uses her as a convenient plot device for the heroes. Unfortunately, these become completely sidelined for the main plot that is driven through moderately generic exposition and good to great action set pieces dealing with the threat of the Idris Elba character, Krall. And the thing about Krall is that he's really just not all that interesting, nor is he really all too different from what we got in the first Star Trek with Nero being the antagonist. The only exceptions being that Nero is actually a decent villain and his motivations were actually clearer. As for the overall clarity of Krall's motivations, I have to admit that I would fail at giving a proper description of his motivations because all throughout the film, as Idris Elba appeared on screen, I did find myself drifting in and out. And keep in mind, this is coming from somebody who is a fan of Idris Elba and believes him to be criminally underused here. That said, even though I am better off now than what I was when I walked out of the theater, thanks to the powers of the internet, I'm not going to count off points for that because I wasn't paying attention. But what I will say is that the problem is that I just don't simply care to know his motivations. Krall, on a very basic surface level, is a bland villain. He's kind of like Apocalypse from X-Men. And it really doesn't help at all when Idris Elba is forced to don some of the worst prosthetics I've seen in a movie that is post-2010 for a central performance. It looks awful. I don't know what the hell they were thinking. It looks like some Power Ranger shit. And again, perhaps there is something deep that lies beneath that exterior, but given the way Idris Elba is directed, he's just there to talk in a very low, grisly voice and just look, I guess, somewhat menacing, but he's really not. Now, I have not yet talked about the spectacle as of yet, for the most part, albeit that some of it is a little overlong to the point of exhaustion, particularly one that features the Starship Enterprise towards the beginning of the film. I thought that was way too long, and some of the hand-to-hand stuff is a little too shaky, but for the most part, I think the spectacle has some good to quite great moments. The CGI ranges from good to mostly great, and some of the more practical stuff, like the scene featuring Kirk riding around on a bike, is pretty cool. There's also some really nice second unit stuff going on here for those who may not know what I'm talking about. It's the stuff that kind of looks like it's been shot with a GoPro or something along that line. Something that looks like this. But really the pieces of spectacle that stood out to me the most was one scene in particular featuring Beastie Boys. That was a fun scene. There's also the third act of the film that features this action sequence that takes place in the city that looks as if it were created by M.C. Escher or more contemporary figures, Christopher Nolan, like Inception with his warped cityscapes. It really is creative use of CGI, and that's my thing with CGI. If you're going to use it, then do something creative with it, and this does just that. As for any last statements, the first trailer to this movie really kind of made it seem as if it was going for something more in the realm of Guardians of the Galaxy, beefing up the banter, kind of going for something a little bit more comedic, but in reality, that's really kind of not what this film is. From what I can see, this film actually has the least amount of laughs, the least amount of fun, the least amount of wonderment, and actually has less to say. Star Trek Beyond is not a bad movie, but do I think it's as good as the first film? That would be a hell no. And do I think it's better than the second one? That would also be a no. The first Star Trek sits at a strong 4, the second one, Into Darkness, is at a pretty strong 3.5, and this one, Star Trek Beyond, sits at a very light, and I do mean very light, 3 out of 5. If you are somebody who has seen Star Trek Beyond, then do let me know your thoughts on it, and as always, I'm Colin Kirkland, and thank you so much for watching.